So the actual title that I gave, which was kind of a, oh gosh, I need a title, pick a thought experiment that I'm familiar with, is Beyond the Ship of Theseus, because I figure that's one lots of people have heard of, I hope. Jordan has, it'll do. But basically, I want to talk about how video games, so I've done a few talks on ethics here before, I don't know if you've seen them, but they're basically about how video games do interesting things with ethics, or they fail horribly at ethics, which is the more common outcome. So I'm going to go a bit further than that today. There will be some talk about ethics, because it's my favorite, but I'm going to talk about thought experiments more generally and how they apply to video games. I've got, basically my entire references are just like names of thought experiments, because they've got really stupid names sometimes. I like my subject, but... So we're going to start off with kind of, do you know what thought experiments are in general? Vaguely. So it's exactly what it sounds like. It's an experiment that you only do in your brain, which doesn't sound that useful when you think about it, because, like, what good is it? But it's very good when it comes to particularly philosophical constructs that you can't do. So if you want to find out people's ethical intuitions, or if you want to find out how they feel about the state of consciousness, you can use it in science. Schrödinger's cat is a famous thought experiment that everyone gets wrong and nobody understands what it actually means. So I'm not going to talk about that one. There's a video game that you might have seen that's called Schrödinger's cat, and it has a cat that's literally half dead and alive, and that's a bad example of using a thought experiment in a game. Don't do that. But that's kind of the point of them. It's just you kind of sitting down, thinking about specific situations or specific constructs, and trying to reason your way through to an answer. Philosophy likes them because obviously you can't really do actual experiments, especially with some of their experiments that would involve a lot of murder and probably not a good idea. But this is why video games are actually a really nice way of doing it, because video games kind of do a lot of murder. And people are used to that, so it's a nice space to kind of start putting these things in. Now, some of you might think, isn't just like a thought experiment, but put in a game, a simulation? And for this more science kind of thought experiments, this would be true. This is why you have things like computational physics, theoretical chemistry. That's kind of the realms of where they start to do simulations in realms of what was previously something they would just think about. When they have the computing power, they can then actually do it. That's not possible with ethics or sort of the philosophy of mind, because I'm not really sure how you do it, except for be like, hey, computer, here's a situation. What would you do, computer? It's not going to tell us anything about what human brains or what our own intuitions would be. It would just be like whatever we program the computer to say at this point. And if it was an AI, we'd be having a whole bunch more problems. So basically, I'm going to go through some of the, well, I say my favorites, some of the ones that are easiest to explain and have some of the weirder concepts in them, and how they're already in video games and how they might be used in an interesting way in video games. So I'm going to start with Wildstar, because it's going free to play in August, and I picked it up last week, and I have played it too much. But it had a really interesting thing that I noticed about this. So there's who's it by? It's by somebody called Davidson. This is the bit I don't know and what I'll be checking in here. There's a thought experiment called the Swamp Man. And now that sounds really interesting and like it's out of a comic book, but it's not. The basic idea is that there's a dude walking around. It's always dudes. And usually if someone's dying, they're fat or a child. This is just philosophy. I'm going to get that out of the way now. But yeah, so there's a dude, he's walking around in a swamp, lightning happens. They're very specific, these thought experiments. It hits him, he dies, he dissolves into molecules. Then, lo and behold, lightning strikes somewhere else in the swamp, and the same, well, different molecules, but the same pattern of molecules reappears, and it appears to be the man again, and it's got the same brain makeup. Is it the same person? Now, if this were me, well, when you do this kind of thought experiment, in philosophy, your first thought is usually, really? You want me to base my intuitions on a swamp man with light? Okay. But in Wildstar, the death system is a little bit more explicit than you would find it in quite a lot of games. I die a lot in Wildstar because I'm not very good, so I've encountered this a lot. But when you die, you res at a hollow crypt. And narrator, whoever the guy who reses you at the hollow crypt is, makes it very explicit that you were dead. With lines like, oh, you spent a lot of time in the grave, don't you? There's no subtlety. It's not, oh, you weren't dead and I magically brought you back. It's, here you are, I've made a new you. That's a bit more interesting than the Swamp Man example, because while you're playing hours and hours of this game, it's quite easy for you to think, is it the same version of me? And that's a space that it might be a lot easier for philosophers to communicate with people, to work out intuitions about this, to say, do you think if that was real, would it actually be you coming out of the holocrypt? Instead of going on this long, convoluted story about Swamp Man. I know which one I would find easier to convey an answer to, and most people would find it easier as a point of reference. So that's kind of the angle I'm going to take here. Obviously, not all of them are that simple. How many of you have played the Swapper? Oh, yay, that's handy. So the Swapper is a really good game for bringing up a really common one, which is the idea of where consciousness sits. So without going into too much depth, there's a few schools of thought on what consciousness is. You've got the idea that it's purely a physical thing that is born out of the brain, it just happens. You've got the purely spiritualist kind of side, which is the opposite, that it's just some disembodied thing that kind of ends up in a brain. We don't know how, it just does. And then you've got all kinds of things in between that. The Swapper is really good as a thought experiment for this, because if I tried to say to you, sort of, I was telling my boyfriend this in the car on the way over because it's my favourite ridiculous thought experiment. It's called China Brain, which sounds, I like when I can always tell who's done this before. It's the idea, and it's going to sound stupid enough, I'm not messing up, it's just this weird, is that you get everybody in China, and you give China, because it's densely populated, is I think the theory, and you give everybody a walkie-talkie or a two-way radio, and you assign them all a job. But this job isn't like a normal job. It's the role of what a neuron in your brain would do. And you get them all to communicate their brain jobs via their walkie-talkies, and you somehow, via satellite, it's very non-specific, plug this in to a body, and you see, does it have a mind? How many of you think that China Brain would be able to run a body? Yeah, I thought not. Oh, we got a couple. That's not great, is it? And if I asked you to think about, what does this make you think about consciousness? Most of you would go, that you've got too much time on your hands. But if I showed you the Swapper, and then I asked for your ideas about consciousness, you'd probably have a lot more to say to me. Because that idea of having to swap between bodies as you go forces you to confront a lot of these ideas, like, am I still the same person I was at the beginning? Are any of the people here the same? Did I just kill myself? Or did I kill someone else? Or was that not alive? Now I'm not in it. And it's a much easier way for philosophers to kind of communicate to people who haven't done ridiculous philosophy degrees about China Brain, to get them to think about these ideas, which are interesting. So yeah, they're sort of two ones that I've seen that have been done well. Then we get some of the more interesting ones that I want to see video games do. So most of you will have heard of the Trolley Problem. There is a game called that, I believe. I hate the Trolley Problem, yeah. Jordan. Yeah. The idea is, it's very simple. It's like, oh, look, there's a train. There's one person on this track. There are 5 people on this track. It is heading towards the 5. Do you turn it towards the 1, or do you let it hit the 5? And this is apparently meant to make people think about, their ethical intuitions, but most people sit there and, because I've done this before to non-philosophy groups, and they'll sit there and go, can I stop the train? No. Why? Because the experiment says you can't. But why? Because you can't. Can I just choose to jump in front of it myself? No. But why not? Because the experiment says you can't. Why? And it gets, people don't spend time thinking about the actual point of the experiment because they're spending too much time trying to find loopholes around it. Now, I don't know about you, but to me that sounds like how a lot of people play video games. So it seems a lot more intuitive to me to present something like that to somebody in a video game context, where they can try and do all the loopholes, but luckily, because programming, although glitches, hopefully they won't be able to break all of the loopholes, and they'll be forced to confront it. But they probably won't be sitting there thinking, why are you trying to trick me, philosopher? Because they're used to engaging with games that respond in that way to them. That said, you'll always have at least one person who makes a mod that means that everyone, or no one, it's usually everyone, dies. So there are limits on what we can do with it. I think my favourite example on here, I can't remember the name of who made this one, but there's a very famous experiment. There's so many experiments. And it wants to get your intuitions not just between groups of people, because most people in the Trolley Problem tend to say they'd hit the one person, because even if they don't like quantifying the value of lives, it seems to make sense to save 5 over 1. And that's the usual answer. There's variations, especially when you start adding in the ability to, as I said, fat people, to push a fat guy in front of the train. I don't know why philosophers seem to think this is a valid solution to a problem, but they do. But there's one which, instead of trying to get you to think about the value of sort of amounts of people, wants you to think about the value of lives. It gets into all kinds of stupid extremes to try and get people to react. But one of the common ones I've seen people phrase it as is like, there is your child, or like a child that you care about. And there is the man who you read in the papers yesterday has a cure for cancer, and they're both drowning, and you can only save one. Who do you pick? Like, most people kind of look at this and go, well, can't the man swim? As you can tell, philosophers aren't very good at thinking of boundaries. But I was thinking the other day, most people in that situation don't have any investment in either of these people. Like, yeah, you can say, oh, yeah, it's a kid that you care about. Are there kids that I care about? Like, you're making quite a large assumption here. And equally, oh, you read in the paper that this guy has a cure for cancer. Well, if I read it in the Daily Mail, I'm not going to really take it on that much value. So there's all those kind of bits that, you know, if you're doing it as a thought experiment, your brain is going to think of. If you're doing it in a video game, now can you imagine, most of you will play The Walking Dead. If you face the choice between somebody who had a cure for the zombies and Clem drowning, you're going to have an instinctive response to that in the way that you're not going to have an instinctive response to me saying, oh, it's a child and a cancer guy, because you don't know either of those people. You have no investment in them. But when it's Clem, and like you've played however many hours of protecting Clem, but also there's this horrible thing, you're genuinely going to have to react to that. You will either have an intuition or you will be racked with guilt for days. It's probably going to be the racked with guilt for days if I've met anyone who plays these kind of games. So that's the kind of space. So what I'm not suggesting is that I'm kind of suggesting that we be terrible and make gamers do horrible things in video games. But I'm not suggesting we suddenly try and put in thought experiments in really odd places in video games, because to be honest, like, there's already enough stuff in video games that feels tacked on. I'm thinking sort of BioShock here. They try to do philosophy, especially in Infinite, and it just feels like, I read a philosophy book, and oh my god, guys, did you know the colour red that I see isn't the colour red you see? So I don't like that. But what I'm suggesting instead is rather kind of think about the kind of decisions or what themes that are in video games, and how you can use already existing sort of theoretical and philosophical, I can't say that word today, thought experiments as a background. Because they've already done the work for you. You already know what kind of responses people give. Most of them keep stats on these things. They've already done all the variants. So it's really nice so you can have a look at that and think, you know what, I think I'm interested in how my players think about consciousness. The dev who made the swapper clearly was interested in how people think about the self. Obviously, not all games are that deep, and I don't expect them to be, but say when you get to ethical decisions in Dragon Age, there's Iron Bull's personal quest and Inquisition, which I won't mention specifically, is basically kind of the trolley problem, but scaled up with people you care about instead of randoms tied to a track. And that's quite nice, but most people aren't going to watch that and think, oh, I'm doing philosophy right now, because let's face it, most people don't think of philosophy as a thing that you do on a casual basis. I guess so most of the point of what I'm getting towards with this talk is that one of the things I dislike about philosophy, and it might just be because I did it at Oxford, where it's very traditional, and very straight white dudes talking about logic a lot. But one of the things is that philosophy isn't the most accessible of subjects. If you try and look it up at any point, you mostly get Descartes. I hate Descartes, don't read Descartes. Utilitarianism, which has got so many problems. I'm just listing the ones I hate. But basically, it's quite hard to find interesting stuff that's easy and understandable for you to read that you care about. Like, it's, you know, if you like science, you can go, oh, what's a cool science thing that happened? And you can find out all kinds of cool stuff, like they're making cures for diseases, or they've made a material that can do something cool. But if you go, oh, what's happening in philosophy? People are arguing about definition of words still, and they will never stop, because that's how they get money. So by putting sort of philosophy in a form into video games, it's a really good way of getting people to engage with important ideas, such as, you know, what is consciousness, without them having to go to the library and take out a book from the 1600s of some old dead guy, kind of talking about counterfactuals and just a bunch of ridiculous stuff that you don't know what it means, and you have no reference for. So, basically, yes, games as philosophical tools is one of the things I'm arguing for here. One of the other things is that it's going to be very important this is my last section of detailed lists. One thing that games are really good at getting us to think about now, that philosophy is invested in, does want to think about, but doesn't really have the tools to engage people with yet, is artificial intelligence and sort of simulated or virtual realities. Like, there's so much recent philosophy on this stuff, and it's all written by people who spend all their time in universities thinking about robots, instead of actually, thinking about the impact of simulated reality. They're not the kind of people who spend an entire, 3 years in WoW or something like that. But with video games, we get the opportunity to start actually thinking about how these things affect us. So the reason I say utilitarianism earlier was awful is because there's a thought experiment about it that proves it's awful, or it should prove it's awful if you all agree with me. It's called The Experience Machine, and it's by Nozek, if you want to look him up. He's interesting. His idea is that in a world where the ultimate thing and goal and goodness is happiness, if we could just be plugged into a machine that would just make us permanently happy, why wouldn't we? And this is the question that philosophers have been trying to talk about for decades, and it's usually, there's something to do with, realness. Yeah, that's worth investing in. But for people who play video games, you have a little bit more of an actual thing. It's because that way, it's would you want to spend your life in a simulated reality? Do you spend a lot of your time in a simulated reality? Some people already do. So that will give you a different perspective on the answer. You might still say, no, that's why it's a simulated reality that I can leave and come back to. But that's something that people usually discussing philosophy won't talk about. They'll just talk about how, the Matrix. They love the Matrix. It's the most recent pop culture that they've got. But then you've got all your other stuff. So you've got your things like, have any of you heard of the Chinese room? I like Jordan. She's great. The Chinese room is the idea that if you sat in a room and people fed you in, things written in Chinese, and you had a book that told you how to respond to the things written in Chinese, you could do that. And the person outside would be like, oh my gosh, the person in that room speaks amazing Chinese. And you're inside the room going, no. That's how they conceive of AI. And if you play video games, you'll probably have a good idea of what they mean when they say that. It's like when you're in Mass Effect. Garrus doesn't really love you. I'm sorry. But, I know. I'm so sorry. That was the worst timing. But, when you say lovely things to Garrus is just reading from this little script box and saying the right things back. He's in the Chinese room. And that's the thing, though, that it means that you will have a stronger response to this thought experiment than most everyday people, even if you don't love Garrus, like Helen loves Garrus. I'm so sorry. But yeah, so you're as people who play video games. I'm not going to say gamers, because I play video games, and I am not really a gamer. I just like a couple of them. You're definitely in a place where you have the tools to think about this kind of thought experiment in a way that goes beyond what kind of your average person who has an interest in philosophy might do, because you have a point of reference for it. So basically, thought experiments, they're great. And now I should probably mention the Ship of Theseus, because that was the title. But honestly, it's not really one that fits that well with video games.
Mushroom 11.
Okay, but yeah.
Why don't you just come back up, Jules?
Yeah. At some point, we need to do a joint talk on philosophy, because I like ethics and you don't. So it'll be great. But the Ship of Theseus is actually, I guess, it's one you can do at home in Minecraft and see what your intuition feels like. The Ship of Theseus is the idea that we have a ship and it needs repairs badly. So we take off one plank at a time and we put a new plank in place. At what point does the ship stop being the same ship? This is obviously meant to get you into complicated ideas about identity, like at what point does a person stop being a person? Is it when all your skin cells have changed? Is it if you get amnesia? All of these things that might change you as a person. But this is the kind of thing you can test your own intuitions to during playing video games. Sort of how much can you change about your character, about your world? How much can you do before you think, this isn't the same person that I was playing before? Or, this isn't my house. This was my house, but now it's made of diamond. It's not my house. But yeah, so that's the Ship of Theseus. I mostly picked it because it sounded good, and it's a bit more fun than some of these really sad ones. And now I'm going to end on This isn't a serious thought experiment, I will clarify this, but it's one that I love dearly, and it's the buttered cat paradox. And the question is, if a cat lands on all 4 feet, but toast always lands butter side up, if you put a buttered piece of toast on a cat's back, which way will it land? And this is what my degree has taught me. So, thank you.